Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Kirsten, the training coordinator at COVA. So happy to be joined today by Kara Napolitano from LCHT. A couple announcements for you, and then we'll get rolling. If you are watching this webinar live, you will receive an email later this afternoon, which is your proof of attendance. Please keep that for your records. And if you are applying for COVA's Voluntary Victim Advocate Certification, please submit that email with your packet. If you're watching this later on YouTube, we're glad that you'll join us and hope that you find the information helpful. However, please note that archived webinars may not be used towards COVA's Victim Advocate Certification. There are 5 handouts today. You should find those in the handouts pane of your chat box. Please download those during the webinar. If you have any difficulty with that, you can contact me afterwards, and my information's in the chat box. And this is a listen-only presentation. If you've got any questions, go ahead and type them in. I'll help moderate those for Kara. Same, any problem receiving the confirmation email afterwards, go ahead and let me know. And with that, Kara, take it away.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. And thanks so much for everybody for being here, for taking time out of your busy days, and really for turning towards this really difficult issue of human trafficking during the middle of a pandemic, or maybe even 2 pandemics, you know, when we're talking about COVID-19 and racism in the US. So I am very grateful for your participation today. I'd like to know a little bit more about who's in the audience, if possible. If you could put into the chat maybe just your first name and the organization that you work for, and maybe even your role there, that would be super helpful for me. I don't want to take up too much time with introductions. Kirsten was kind enough to put my bio in there too, so you know a little bit about who I am. I work for an organization called the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, and we are located in Denver, but we're a statewide anti-trafficking organization. We've been around since 2005. And the way that we go about this work is we're really looking at the kind of systemic and individual root causes of human trafficking, and looking to end the crime of trafficking in Colorado by addressing those root causes. So we're going to focus on that today in this 101, this Human Trafficking 101. I've got you for an hour. This is the first in a 3-part series that we're partnering with COVA on. So today, and then in 2 weeks from today, and in a month from today, we've got our 2nd and 3rd sessions. So this will be looking at trafficking specifically in Colorado. For this 101, we'll be looking at some federal and state statutes and how those affect the complexities around disclosure and identification. We'll be looking at vulnerabilities, specific industries in Colorado that can kind of lend themselves to potential exploitation. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be looking specifically at red flags and behavioral cues, as well as protocol development for your organization, and as well as for systems. So I'm talking about community protocols, potentially, where we're touching different kinds of sectors and systems to work together to support survivors. And then in 4 weeks, on August 12th, we'll be covering trauma, ACEs, trauma bonding, as well as trauma responsive organizations and interviews. So with that, I will get started. I had my video on just for this first part here, but I'm going to turn my video off just for bandwidth's sake as I head into this slide deck. Okay. So what is trafficking? I wasn't able to see, Kirsten, I wasn't able to see if anything came through in the chat when I asked people to put their name in there, their name and organization. So I'm not sure if I'm not looking in the right place, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's the link that I sent you. We'll fix it for the next 2. Okay. But we've got some ladies from law enforcement victim services on with us, as well as a wide variety of folks from nonprofit. And it looks like someone from judicial or probation.
Great.
And someone from DOC or judicial, I can't quite tell.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Well, I was going to ask you to throw some more things in the chat for this part, but since I can't see it anyway, I'll just start talking. So when we're talking about trafficking, what we find is that there's just a lot of myths and misconceptions out there on what trafficking actually looks like on the ground, especially here, specifically in Colorado, in the greater Denver area, and in some of our more rural and frontier communities. And you know, I'll sort of lean on media for that, some of the myths and misconceptions. A lot of people are kind of relying on media or on Google to base their understanding of what trafficking looks like, and that can be problematic for a lot of reasons. And so we see a lot of like stereotypes and, like I said, misconceptions about this, what this looks like on the ground. So I'm going to start from the beginning of when we first wrote these statutes, when we first kind of coined the phrase human trafficking, and what it's looked like for the last 20 years since then. So we first coined the phrase or wrote into statute the term human trafficking in the year 2000. So that was only 20 years ago. So what we've got here is this very old crime, right? This human trafficking, exploitation. Sometimes it's called modern slavery. Whatever way you want to describe it, the crime's been around forever, right? Exploitation of humans has been around since humans first, started living together. But we didn't define it into statute until 20 years ago. And so what that means is we have this incredibly old crime with this incredibly new response. The majority of trainees, of attendees of these kinds of trainings that I facilitate have not had a human trafficking training in the past, even though they may be working with victims or survivors of trafficking. Mostly that's because it's not required for most organizations or most professions. At the federal level, there's recommendations that healthcare providers, for example, get a human trafficking training, but no funding or mandate to make that mandatory. And so what we see is sort of like a piecemeal response. We see some communities where people are super educated on what trafficking looks like, and others where there's been very little conversations around it. So what we're going to talk about today is both labor and sex trafficking. Another thing that's often left out of the conversation is labor trafficking. So we're going to make sure that we focus on that enough today. So what you've got in front of you now is a very kind of simplified, abbreviated definition of human trafficking. Human trafficking at the international level, at the UN level, is a severe form of exploitation for labor, which includes sex as a form of labor through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Okay, so at the UN level in the year 2000, we wrote the Palermo Protocol, and many UN members signed on to that. Two important things to note here about this international definition that differ from our federal definition are that at this international level, we included sex as a form of labor. In the US, we parsed it out, and I'm going to show you that definition in just a moment. And then we also said there has to be an element of force, fraud, or coercion for it to be trafficking. And we didn't make any exceptions to that at the international level. We said you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to prove that it's trafficking, whether it's labor or sex trafficking, no matter what the age. So that was this international definition. And now if you'll look at this next slide here, you'll see our TVPA, our US federal definition. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act actually parsed out the definition into 3 categories of trafficking. So we said we differentiated between those who are under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex versus those who are 18 or over involved in commercial sex. We said that those under the age of 18 don't have the cognitive ability to consent to commercial sex acts. And therefore, we don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to prove that there's trafficking present. And so what that means in practice is that anyone under the age of 18 involved in any form of commercial sex is by definition a victim of human trafficking, okay? We made an exception to that force, fraud, or coercion rule. That's complicated for a lot of reasons I'd like to highlight now. One is that for many of us who've worked with victims and survivors of exploitation, we know that there are many under the age of 18 who are involved in commercial sex acts who do not self-identify as a victim of anything. No one's forcing or frauding or coercing them into doing this. They're doing it to meet their own survival needs, and they don't feel like they're victims. And often those same individuals don't like to be told that they're victims. I think that's very human. Most people in general don't like to be told that they're how to identify. And so it can cause mistrust, confusion when you tell someone they're a victim of something and that's not how they self-identify. Another couple of things to note about this first category is that commercial component. So I said commercial sex acts. Commercial means trading anything of value. So it doesn't necessarily mean money. It could be trading for a place to stay for the night, for drugs, for a ride, for protection. Trading any sex act for anything of value makes it commercial. And when I say sex act, often our minds go straight to the sex act of prostitution. While that is, of course, a sex act, that's not the only one, right? There's stripping and pornography and many other kinds of commercial sex acts. So what we're saying is anyone under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex acts is by definition a victim of trafficking, regardless of how they self-identify. That also means that they should not be arrested if they're under the age of 18 for example, selling sex, right? Prostitution is illegal. But what we said with this law is that anyone under the age of 18 involved in prostitution is by definition a victim, right? So they shouldn't be arrested for that crime. So this law should protect them from being arrested for this crime of selling sex, of prostitution. The second category is for those who are 18 and over involved in commercial sex acts. Same definition of commercial sex acts, but what we said was those who are 18 and over do have the cognitive ability to consent. And so in order to prove that what they're doing is exploitative and not choice, there has to be an element of force, fraud, or coercion. That may seem straightforward, but it can be really much more complicated in practice. If someone is 18, right, they're 3 days older than they were when they were 17 3 days ago. They're in the same situation, but now they have to prove that element of force, fraud, or coercion in order to not potentially be arrested for a crime that they're being forced to commit as a result of their trafficking, like prostitution. So this can get really tricky. If somebody has a trauma bond with their trafficker, for example, if they're being trafficked by a parent or guardian, if they are being forced or coerced into the situation, but they're terrified to tell a law enforcement officer that that's the truth. And so often in this situation, people are arrested for crimes that they're forced to commit as a result of their trafficking because they don't disclose the force or fraud or coercion out of fear or confusion or love, right? In the case of trauma bonding. So that's those first two categories. And then the third category is forced labor. We didn't parse that out into 18 and over and 18 and under. We said anyone involved in forced labor does have to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to prove that it's forced labor. But what we see in Colorado and in the US in general are types of forced labor that we often don't consider. So we see forced labor in many regular markets like construction, restaurants, hospitality in general, hotels, landscaping, agriculture, ranching, domestic servitude, nannying. But we also see forced labor in illicit markets like forced drug dealing, forced panhandling, forced other kinds of criminal activity, forced breaking and entering even. We see individuals who are being trafficked for sex against their will, also being forced to commit crimes against their clients, and therefore they're being trafficked for both sex and for labor. So it's forced labor, even if it's illegal, like selling drugs, if it's being forced through force, fraud, or coercion. There's a little note on the bottom of this page that this isn't limited to those who are foreign-born youth or females. And that's just kind of a shout out to some of these myths and misconceptions. We tend to think of this as something that affects young people who are females, and often young people who are foreign-born females. While all of those identities are vulnerabilities to trafficking, it is certainly not limited to those identities. So is being foreign-born in the year 2020 a vulnerability to exploitation? Of course, right? We've got more restrictive immigration laws. We've got an uptick of xenophobia. Immigration has become a hot button issue, and we've got deportations up over the last decade. So being foreign born is certainly a vulnerability, But in Colorado, what we've seen from our data is that it's about 50-50, 50% foreign-born, 50% domestic. Is being a youth a vulnerability to trafficking? Sure. Young people have different rights than adults. They have different access to resources and knowledge and education. There's a power dynamic there. Young people are supposed to do what older people say. Often they don't know their rights. The other piece of that is young people's brains aren't fully developed yet. So physiologically, under the age of 25, 26, young people are simply more likely to make risky choices than adults. So being a young person is certainly a vulnerability. But what the ILO estimates, the International Labor Organization, is that young people or people under the age of 18 make up about 25% of trafficking victims worldwide. And we find something similar in Colorado. For example, we run the statewide human trafficking hotline, the laboratory to combat human trafficking. Only about 5% of our calls to the hotline are in regard to young people or coming from young people. Now, that doesn't mean that only 5% of trafficking is affecting young people, but that does mean that's who's calling the hotline. So 95% of our calls, on average, between 600 and 700 calls a year, are with regard to adult trafficking. And is being a female a vulnerability to trafficking? Well, that's a little bit controversial, I suppose, but yes, sure, it could be. But what the statistics say is that while more females are trafficked for sex than males, it's still only about 75%. And other genders, male and transgender individuals, are also trafficked for sex. Transgendered individuals are often disproportionately represented in the survivor population. And then when it comes to labor trafficking, it's about 50-50. So 50% female, 50% male, something around there. We do see some sectors that are more heavily male and others that are more heavily female, but it's about 50-50. So this next slide, the action means purpose model, the AMP model, is another way to think through this definition. So there has to be, I mean, if we're identifying trafficking as something different than other experiences, other crimes, another way to think through this is to identify one thing from each one of these categories in order for it to be trafficking. So there has to be an action, a means, and a purpose for it to be trafficking. And otherwise, we're probably looking at something related, some related crime like domestic violence or child abuse or sexual assault or wage theft. But there has to be an action, means, or a purpose for it to be trafficking. So the most common action that we see is recruitment. The movie Taken or some of the media or some of the television shows that we've seen would have us believe something different, that kind of people are chosen at random, stolen off the street, kind of thrown into a moving vehicle. We see a lot of Facebook warnings out there, you know, lock up your kids, the traffickers are coming kind of conversation. It's just not what we generally see on the ground. The most common action is recruitment, and people are recruited because they have vulnerability, right? People are vulnerable because they're experiencing homelessness, or because they are using substances and they're looking for any way to get high, or because they, you know, their parents are absent and they're home alone a lot and they're looking for love. There's lots of reasons why people might be vulnerable, but it's usually a vulnerability that attracts the trafficker to recruit that individual. So people can be recruited online, they can be recruited at a school, they can be recruited from a team sport, they can be recruited by a teacher who identifies that vulnerability and kind of leans into it. Most of the time, people are trafficked by someone that they know. There's tons of research out there to support this, that more than 50% of the time, someone is being trafficked by a family member or a loved one. And then an additional 20% of folks are being trafficked by an employer. So that recruitment piece is pretty heavy. Someone may be harbored, that's held somewhere against their will, kind of locked up, chained up. Again, Google would have us believe that kind of everyone is. And then I've had questions when I tell people that, you know, generally people are not locked up. They ask me, well, why don't they just leave? If they're not locked up, why don't they just run? And the answer is actually much more human than we think. There's lots of reasons why people don't run. Sometimes it's because they don't have anywhere better to run to. because their alternative is sleeping on the street or going back to a violent home. And so sometimes people stay because they don't have any other better solutions or alternatives. Sometimes people stay out of fear, threats of violence against family members, threats of deportation, threats of, we'll report you to child welfare and they'll take your kids away, or we'll report you to child welfare and they'll take you away from your family. So while sometimes people are locked up, chained up, tied up, and that certainly is true sometimes, it's definitely not always the case. It's not what we usually see. People don't really have to be locked up in these situations to stay because of all the reasons I've just mentioned and many others that I haven't. Sometimes people are transported across an international border, across a state border, across town to a motel. But transportation is not necessary. So the word trafficking often makes us think that transportation is part of someone's experience. It's an option for one of the actions, but it's definitely not mandatory. It doesn't have to be present. And often people are trafficked out of their own home or out of their own neighborhood and never transported anywhere at all. Someone may be provided. That's like, I provide my child to you in exchange for drugs or in exchange for a place to stay. You may have heard recently over the last few months an uptick of people being exploited in order to stay in their housing because they couldn't afford rent. Right, 33 million people are out of work right now. Although there was a moratorium on evictions, we still heard stories of folks being coerced into trading sex to pay for their rent for that month. And that could be trading sex with a child in order to stay in that living situation. We've also seen an uptick of this provide action alongside the opioid crisis. And then there's obtained, and that's, again, that Taken movie, kind of snatched off the street, thrown into a vehicle, obtained in that way, kidnapped. It's just not what we often see. Is it possible? Has it happened? Sure, I'm sure it has. In my many years of doing this work, I've never met anyone that was their story. And all the folks that I have met, their story was different. They knew their trafficker, at least to some extent. The means, the next column here, is through force or fraud or coercion. We're going to talk through what that means in just a moment, the definitions of those words. But the big star here is to remind us that there's an exception. So we said anyone under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex does not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to prove that it's trafficking. But all other forms of trafficking, we do have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And the purpose is for commercial sex or labor or services. So at its core, human trafficking is about profit. And that's what often differentiates it from other crimes. So domestic violence, for example, can sometimes look like trafficking, but domestic violence is one thing. If they're profiting off of the violence that they're committing, that's what can turn it into trafficking. So if a father is selling their daughter into commercial sex and profiting off of it, that would be both domestic violence and sex trafficking. But if they're not profiting off of it, then it would be exploitation and lots of other forms of violence, but not necessarily trafficking. Yeah, so that's heavy stuff. Kirsten, any questions so far? As I'm covering some very heavy topics.
Not so far, no.
Okay.
But actually, I have a question, if that's okay. You and I spoke when we were setting this up about if Colorado had a true safe harbor law, or kind of what that means. Is that upcoming in the presentation, or could you spend a moment on that? Because now I'm realizing I don't for sure know what that means.
Sure, yeah. It is not upcoming in the presentation, but briefly, there are, I think, 32 states that have safe harbor laws. Colorado is not technically one of them, but our state laws now almost mirror our federal laws, and that's very recent. Only last year did that actually happen. So until recently, our state laws actually did make it legal to arrest somebody for like the crime of prostitution under the age of 18. Our state laws have now kind of caught up with our federal laws in that sense, but we don't have a safe harbor for child victims of labor trafficking yet necessarily. It's sort of nuanced. I mean, it's not really obvious. Um, it's I would have to go through the statute and show the differences, but we do have affirmative defense, which means if you are arrested for a crime that's associated with your trafficking situation, you can argue that in court. So it's almost a safe harbor law, but not quite. And safe harbor laws apply to youth under the age of 18.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I've talked a lot about force, fraud, and coercion so far, and I just want to clarify what I mean by that, and talk through kind of what some of these situations can look like for folks. So force is pretty easy to picture. So these italicized questions that you see here are more things that you would be sort of asking yourself if you were trying to make an identification, not something you would necessarily be asking a victim or a survivor, but force is being locked up, chained up, being threatened with harm, physical harm, that kind of thing, not being allowed to leave. So if someone is being forced to stay at the location where they work, that should be a red flag. It doesn't mean that everyone who lives where they work is being trafficked. In some cases, we see that in agriculture pretty often. We see it in restaurants occasionally. So it doesn't mean that everyone in that situation is being trafficked, but it should be a red flag. Is that person being charged an exorbitant amount of money for the place that they're staying, and it's all coming out of their paycheck, and in fact they're not getting a paycheck because all of their money is going towards housing and food that they're getting? Is that person locked in? What if they get injured? Can they go seek medical care? Has anyone ever threatened them? These are questions you could be sort of asking sort of yourself in order to identify potential force. But force isn't always used, and it's certainly not always used at the beginning of an experience. So often someone is coerced or frauded into a situation first, and then force is brought into the situation later if they choose not to comply. So sometimes it's a fraudulent promise. Was someone promised something and given something else? Are they doing work that wasn't part of the original deal? So in an agricultural example, we might see someone promised to be making $14 an hour picking tomatoes. They're going to be working 12-hour days, 6 days a week for 4 months. And then when they start their transportation to that farm in, say, Florida, they actually find that they're taken to a different state where they didn't know where they were going, and they don't have any community, and they're going to a farm that doesn't grow tomatoes at all, and they're not getting paid per hour, they're getting paid per unit, and they're making significantly less than they would have, working longer hours, working 7 days a week instead of 6, and maybe they're even being forced to pay quite a bit of money for their housing, which was supposed to be part of the incentive to go work there. And so at the end of 2 weeks, instead of getting paid, the $800 that they were expecting, they're getting a check for $36 or something like that. That's what a fraudulent promise can look like. Or it could be, come with me, you're gonna be a model, we're gonna go to Vegas together, it's gonna be great. And along the way, on the way to Vegas, they're actually stopping in Airbnbs, and the person that convinced them to come with them to Vegas is pimping them out in order to pay for gas. Fraudulent promises of love, fraudulent promises of employment, that's what we see pretty frequently. And then there's coercion. So if fraud or force are kind of sometimes part of an experience, we see coercion as always part of the experience. Coercion is an incredibly powerful tool. All you really need to do to see how this is used is to think about the people that you love most in the world, and what you might be willing to do to protect them and keep them safe. If somebody knows that you have a 6-year-old sister, they might say, do this or I'll make her do it. Right? Or if someone knows you have an undocumented uncle who lives with you, they might say, do this or I'm calling ICE on your uncle. And so what we find is people sort of tacitly complying in their exploitation out of fear, and that's what coercion is. So kinds of questions that you could be asking yourself, has anyone threatened to report this person to the authorities? And I don't always mean law enforcement here. It could be law enforcement. It could be that they're doing something illegal, like selling drugs or selling sex. And someone says, if you report me, I'll report you. They'll arrest you too. But it could also be, yes, deportation if there's a family member or themselves that are undocumented. It could be reporting to child welfare. Do what I say, or they'll take your kids away. Do what I say, or they'll take you away from your family. We recently had a case of a priest in Boston, actually, that was using coercive tactics to get young boys to send illicit pictures of themselves to him. And then he was using the threat of reporting this to their parents and to schools in order to get them to send more illicit photos. So they would send illicit photos and he would say, well, if you don't send me something, a picture of you doing X, Y, Z, then I'm going to show this to your parents. I'm going to show this to your school. And so he was getting them to comply in that way. And then he was selling the photos, and that's how he was profiting off of it. And that's what made it trafficking. So threatening to report someone to authorities, whatever that means to the person, threatening to harm a family member or loved one. Someone who doesn't have control over their own ID documents should be a red flag. So in labor trafficking situations, we see people confiscating passports, which is illegal, by the way. But we see it in sex trafficking as well. We see pimps taking people's IDs. It's really hard to get around in the US without your ID. It might feel like someone sort of owns you if they have control of your own ID. So in any kind of situations with healthcare providers or service providers of any kind, we always say, if you see someone in the parking lot giving someone else their own ID back, that should be your very first red flag. Why doesn't someone have control over their own ID? And then there's debt bondage, and debt is a major part of a lot of people's experiences. So not only does the literature say this, but my own experience in talking to survivors, debt has often played a part in their experience. So it could be a drug debt, it could be a debt of protection. Somebody was watching out for you and you owe them. Somebody gave you a place to stay or let you and your kids stay with them, and so you owe them. It's even if it's just a perceived debt and not an actual one, it's often used as leverage and coercion. So a couple of ways that we see debt bondage play out, particularly in Colorado, I want to highlight here because they're pretty common. So one of them has to do with this sign. It says part-time job, $10 to $40 an hour, no transportation, no problem. Must be 14 years or older, adults welcome, nightly bonuses, weekly paychecks, team environment, call today, start tomorrow. I took this picture actually of the sign that was right outside my office in 5 Points in Denver. Of course, I ripped it down immediately after, but I'm sure you've seen signs like this. When I do live presentations and I ask people that question, almost everyone raises their hand. We've seen this sign, they're ubiquitous, right? These are targeting vulnerable young people. And when I say young people, I don't necessarily only mean people under the age of 18, but they're just targeting people who are having a hard time finding work in the formal economy and are looking for this, easy, quick money, part-time job, $10 to $40 an hour, call today, start tomorrow, could be 14 years old, right? And so we're not only talking about people experiencing homelessness, we're just talking about vulnerable young people. So I'll give you an example of what that might look like. Let's say even in the neighborhood where our office is in Rhino, rents have, quadrupled in the last 10 years. The cost of living in Colorado has increased by 77% in the last 10 years, while the median annual income has only increased by about 4.5%. So people are really struggling to pay their rent. They're working 2 or 3 jobs. So let's say you've got a single mom of 3 that's working 2 jobs and can barely afford the rent, and they're kind of teetering on the edge of homelessness. And she's got a 14-year-old kid who sees this sign and says, I'm gonna help mom, right? This looks like the job for me. They take the number and they call it. These are often traveling sales crews. So we're talking door-to-door sales, candy, magazines, cleaning supplies. I'm not suggesting that, like, you know, your kid's high school that sells candy to raise money for a fundraiser or for a school trip is trafficking. Not all of these are trafficking, but they are often exploitative. So what will happen is the young person will call this number, they'll get picked up, they'll get trained. They're often brought outside of their community. So if this young person calls in from Denver, they may be transported to, say, Kansas or Colorado Springs or Durango or somewhere outside of their community. So they're kind of far away from help. They're usually put up in motel rooms, 8 or 10 kids in a room, in crappy hotel rooms, but they do have a roof over their head. And then they're working crazy hours, you know, 12, 15-hour days, walking around trying to meet really unreasonable quotas. So they're told, you have a debt to us. We trained you, we gave you food, we gave you this hotel, we transported you, now you owe us. And then they're given these unreasonable quotas that they can't possibly meet. And so when it says $10 to $40 an hour, what it really means is $10 to $40 an hour if you meet this impossibly high quota. And so at the end of the day, 10 to 12 to 15 hours of walking around in the neighborhood all day, you know, they're getting $10 or a pack of cigarettes. People stay in these situations because to some extent their needs are being met, right? They do have food, it's not enough. They do have a place to stay. It's, you know, 8 people in a hotel room, but they have a place. And so out of shame and embarrassment for being tricked, or out of trauma bonds with your trafficker and bonds that you form with others in that situation, people stay for some amount of time. And that's one form of debt bondage that we see in Colorado pretty frequently. And the other one is when a smuggling situation can turn into a trafficking situation. So unfortunately, we hear the term smuggling and trafficking often conflated, or we hear it used in unison, smuggling and trafficking, as if it's the same experience. Smuggling is a crime against a border, and trafficking is a crime against a human. Smuggling is consensual. It's illegal, but it's consensual, right? If I want to be smuggled across the Mexican border, I can pay someone $5,000 to take me across the Mexican border. Once I'm across the border into the US, I've been smuggled. It was consensual. Nobody was hurt. It's still illegal. I'm undocumented now, but that's the end of that situation, right? There's no forced labor. There's no forced sex acts. Smuggling can turn into a trafficking situation when, say, the smuggler demands more money at the end of the smuggle, right? They've been brought across the border, and the smuggler, now turning into a trafficker, says, you know what, actually that took a lot longer than expected. We had to take an alternate route because the border was closed and there were more increased border guards, and you know, you owe me an additional $3,000. Well, you don't have that money. Okay, well, come with me, and they're taken to a restaurant or a construction site or a farm in Colorado and forced to work off that supposed debt that they never agreed to. That smuggler, now turned trafficker, knows that they're undocumented and can use that against them, might know where their family lives and somewhere in Central America, and can threaten their family now. And probably knows that they don't really know their rights. They probably don't speak the language. They don't speak English. And so lots of vulnerability there. And so people get trapped in these situations of debt bondage and don't run out of fear of being arrested and deported. Sorry. So I don't want us to be thinking about this crime of trafficking as this kind of far off thing that happens to people we don't know. It's happening to our community members, people we know and love even. You know, trafficking survivors, trafficking victims aren't deviant, and they're not stupid. They're actually making really human choices in order to meet their needs. And we as service providers and law enforcement and those of us, you know, every single one of us on this call is involved in helping people. In the end, if we're honest with ourselves, we know we don't have enough resources to support everyone. And there's a ton of barriers to accessing those resources, right? You have to be the right gender, you have to be the right age, you have to have kids, or you can't have kids, you can't have a dog, you have to be sober, you got to be there by a certain time of day, right? We set up barriers, and I understand why those exist. But it does make it hard for folks who are seeking help. And so when they have needs that need to be met, and we as systems, service providers can't meet those needs, what happens is an exploiter or a trafficker can step in and meet those needs better than we can. And so that's why people end up in these situations. It's not because they're randomly selected off the street. It's because they have these vulnerabilities, and traffickers can read that and try to meet those needs better than we as service providers are doing in some cases. So if someone has experienced abuse or neglect or isolation, they have maybe an unhealthy version of what a healthy relationship looks like. Now, this could be a young person, or it could be a young person who's grown up and to be an adult who's still experienced abuse or neglect or isolation in their past, right? We don't heal our trauma overnight. And just because we turn 18 doesn't mean it goes away. And so if we have an unhealthy version of what a healthy relationship should look like, and someone offers us a relationship, if we are getting no love at home, and we are socially isolated at school, and I meet somebody online who tells me I'm beautiful and they love me and they want to take care of me and they want to get me out of that abusive home that I'm in, I mean, that sounds pretty good, right? It's very human to lean into that relationship and see what that's all about and start forming a bond with that person. If I'm experiencing homelessness, then I've got incredible needs that need to be met. This is Colorado. It is cold. It is dangerous on the street. And when we do street outreach and I talk to folks that are living on the street, it is incredibly common for me to hear things like, yeah, I slept with this guy last night in order to stay at his place. I do it once or twice a week so that I can have a shower. It's very normalized because that person is transgender and there's only one or two shelters in Denver that will allow them to stay there for the night. And so they have to seek a place to stay in another way. And this is what they have to do to survive. So if someone's experiencing homelessness and someone says, hey, you know what, there's this place down the street, they let us stay there for free, all we got to do is a little work for them. Well, it might be worth it to me to go check out, what is that work? What is it that I have to do in order to get off the street, the dangerous and cold street? I might be willing to do a lot of things to stay in that new family home. If I'm experiencing poverty or debt, or I don't have access to formal markets, I mean, that's a lot of people. That could be someone who's undocumented. That could be a young person who's not old enough to work yet. That could be somebody with a criminal record, with a felony. That could just be someone with no skills. If I can't find a job, especially right now during a pandemic with 35 million people out of work and many, many places closed down, I will find income somehow. If somebody offers me a job in the informal economy and my option is to take this crappy job that doesn't pay me minimum wage and is exploitative and I'm feeling abused, but my alternative is sleeping on the street with my 3 kids next week, I'm going to take that crappy job, right? I'm going to allow myself to be exploited because it's better than sleeping on the street with my kids. So that's how people are ending up in these situations, right? Someone's got a marginalized identity. They're a transgender youth whose family doesn't accept that, whose school hasn't accepted that. And someone finds that kid online and says, you are beautiful exactly how you are. And I know someone who transitioned and I can help you through that process. I mean, that might be the very first time in that kid's life that they ever had someone tell them that they love them just the way they are. We are all looking for acceptance. So it's really important that we start to recognize that it is needs being met that is pushing people into these situations and pulling them into it and keeping them there as well. It is not this far away crime that's not happening to anyone we know. It's happening kind of right under our noses. So I'll pick on Google just for another minute here. What you're looking at now is what Google would tell you all trafficking victims look like. Young, female, identified, mostly white or Asian victims of sex trafficking, usually over-sexualized. Often the images are violent, but I don't like to put violent images on the screen. And this is true, right? Young girls are trafficked for sex, and it is terrible, and it should be stopped. But this is only one kind of drop in the bucket, right, of all the different forms of trafficking that we see. And so this is problematic, not because we shouldn't be trying to stop the sex trafficking of young girls, but because we're missing everything else. If this is all we're ever looking for, then this is all we're ever going to find. And if this is all we ever find, then this is all we will ever prosecute, and this is all our numbers will ever reflect. If this is what we're looking for, this is what we'll find. And we'll be missing this. We'll be missing everything else. Labor trafficking of adults, sex trafficking of adults, sex trafficking of transgender individuals, right? All these different sectors where we see trafficking. And not only will we as service providers be missing it, but the trafficking victims and survivors themselves won't see themselves as worthy, right? They won't see themselves in that survivor population. If you don't see yourself in this picture, are you going to self-identify as a victim of trafficking and ask for help? Are you going to say, help me, I'm a victim of human trafficking? If your situation looks more like this, it's unlikely. Like many of us on this call, we didn't know what trafficking was, right? Until we started hearing these kinds of stories. And so we're missing it, and we're missing the opportunity for people to disclose as well, because we're leaving them out of the narrative surrounding trafficking. So to work on the issue of human trafficking means asking yourself and others to care about those who are often perceived as unworthy, rarely considered victims. We're talking about sex workers. Sometimes people are willingly and voluntarily selling sex, and then they are exploited because of that vulnerability, or they are undocumented. We talk about asylees and refugees, people experiencing homelessness, runaways, individuals that are using substances. These people are incredibly vulnerable to trafficking because of the needs that they have. And we tend to forget that this is what our survivor population actually looks like. So briefly, I just want to talk about some of the industries that we see trafficking in Colorado. These first 3 bullet points here: agriculture, ranching, energy, tours and ski resorts, construction. These are all low wage, high turnover, often seasonal jobs with high immigrant populations, high amounts of young people. They're often less regulated sectors. So they don't have the same minimum wage, they don't have the same hourly wage or restrictions. They have different standards for housing situations. All of these factors can contribute to trafficking in these specific sectors, but I mean, we see it in many others. We just see more of it here. I'll give you just one example. Up in the northwest part of the state, we have a large sheep herding population. If you didn't know, many of us in the greater Denver area aren't aware, but in the northwest part of the state, we raise a lot of sheep. It's where our lamb usually comes from. In that part of the state, we have some wealthy landowners who are mostly importing labor from individuals from Peru. So they're over here on H-2A, H-2B visas in most cases, sometimes for as little as 6 months and sometimes for as long as up to like 3 years. They're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, living with the sheep out in very, very remote areas. And these are indigenous individuals. So they're specifically targeted or recruited for this work because they, in their home country, in Peru and in some cases in Chile, they are already raising animals. They have that experience. They're willing to work for cheap, and they raise money to send back to their families in Peru. So they come over here. Often Spanish is the second language being spoken, not the first language. Their first language is an indigenous language, in some cases Quechua. And so they're working in the most remote part of the state. They don't speak the language. They don't know their rights. They're in a place where cell phones don't work. They're already in an industry that they're not being paid minimum wage. They're getting paid $1,250 a month for 24/7 work. And I'm not suggesting that everyone in sheep herding industry is being trafficked by any means, but you can see that power dynamic. And we've had several cases of really severe exploitation, cases of people being starved, people being injured and told to walk hundreds of kilometers to reach a hospital on their own, people being threatened with deportation, physically beaten in some of those situations. And people don't hear about it. We've got I-25 and I-70, running clear across the country in both directions, meeting in Colorado. So we know that drugs and humans are transported across these state borders that way. We've got Denver International Airport, the only international airport within a 600-mile radius. We've got a massive commercial sex industry in Colorado. Like it or not, you've likely met somebody who's purchased sex in Colorado, and we don't know whether or not that person was doing it voluntarily or not. And we've got massive immigration influxes. We've had 1 million people move to Colorado in the last 10 years. Some of our industries, like the construction industry, is 22% immigrant population. So a lot of different factors that are contributing to trafficking in Colorado. Just remembering that we have it in all the states. It's not just Colorado, of course, but those are some of the factors. So what you're looking at now are some headlines. I'm not going to cover all of these, but I'm just going to choose 2 here to talk about briefly. These are some of the cases that actually made it to court. So some of the things that you may have heard about. The Sean Crumpler case up in your top left corner here. When he was first arrested, he was a 50-year-old white male. That was in 2014. This is one of his shell houses. This individual would target young homeless boys, and he would recruit them to come live in his house, be part of his quote unquote family. He would give them drugs and alcohol and a place to stay and food, all in exchange for sex. He didn't live in the house. That was just one of his several houses. And this went on for years, maybe 8 years, something like that. We don't know how many boys passed through this house, but he was arrested on a slew of charges, including knowingly passing HIV on to his victims, for example. And this other one that I want to highlight is the one right in the middle of the screen. 2018, federal jury awards $330,000 to a family that was trafficked on a family farm in southeastern Colorado. That was down in Rocky Ford, Colorado, where they grow a lot of melons, down in the southeast part of the state. This individual owned a large farm that grew melons and other things. He married a Filipino woman who was a US citizen, and they decided that they wanted to bring her family over from the Philippines to the US to live with them. So they hired an immigration lawyer and spent a little bit of money and time, and they were successful in getting green cards for her brother and his wife and their 3 school-aged boys. And when they got over here, they were lied to by the family and said that they owed a bunch of money to the family and that they had to live on the farm and work that debt off. They did in fact have green cards and they didn't have to do that, but they believed their family members. They were forced to work for 3 years without pay, under extreme conditions. They were basically starving, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. They were visited occasionally by social workers and others from the community who expressed concern and actually finally contacted Colorado Legal Services, who identified the case as a case of human trafficking and brought it to a federal jury, who found that they were in fact trafficking this family and awarded the family $330,000. And that was really community involvement that made that happen. These are some numbers. I don't want to spend too much time on numbers because really they're just the tip of the iceberg. For so many reasons that we've already talked about, people don't self-identify as victims of trafficking. Most people haven't received training to identify trafficking themselves. And so most of these cases just fall under the radar. People are not self-identifying, they're not asking for help, and those in positions of power that could help them are missing it. And it's not their fault, it's just that we're not trained to identify it, and it's just one of those crimes that's really happening kind of just below the surface. But some of these numbers here, Rocky Mountain Innocence Loss Task Force is the FBI task force. It's now called something else, but they identified 38 victims in 2018. Those are just child sex trafficking victims, domestic. LCHT is us. We had 608 calls in 2018. About a third of them were from survivors. CDHS is the Colorado Department of Human Services. They had 302 referrals for sex trafficking just in 2018. So these numbers are pretty daunting. And these are our cases in Colorado. So if you hadn't heard me talk for the last hour and you just looked at this list, what you would see is that the overwhelming majority of cases that we've had are the sexual servitude of minors. And you would say, well, obviously that's the problem in Colorado. Why is Kara talking so much about labor trafficking and adult sex trafficking? And the reason that these numbers are so much higher is kind of twofold. One is that there's just more community will. More people care about the sex trafficking of minors than they do about adult labor trafficking, to be blunt, right? That's where the community will is, that's where the funding is, that's where the focus is. And also, we don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to prove these cases, so they're easier to prosecute. So the sexual service, no one's suggesting that we stop prosecuting these cases, of course. We should continue to prosecute the sexual servitude of minors, but I would argue that we should also focus more on sexual servitude of adults and labor trafficking as well. And I think we are. We're starting to do a better job of that in Colorado, and I think our numbers in 2019 and 2020 will reflect that. This is just one piece of legislation I want to make sure I tell you about before we finish today. In 2016, we passed a law in Colorado that went into effect in 2017 that effectively made child sex trafficking a form of child abuse. Before that, it wasn't. Not technically. It was only a form of child abuse if it was being perpetrated by a parent or guardian. In 2016, we said it could be considered a form of child abuse if it was being perpetrated by a third party, so somebody from outside of the family. And so that was really a paradigm shift for child welfare. It mandated the training of child welfare state workers across the state. About half of them have been trained so far, but not everyone yet. We're working on it. And then in May of last year, we amended this law to also include child labor trafficking. So we made child labor trafficking a form of child abuse. And what that means is if you're a mandatory reporter of child abuse, then you're a mandatory reporter of child sex and labor trafficking as of May 2019. So it would be, your same mandatory reporting procedures that you would take for a form of child abuse, but including child sex and labor trafficking in that law. The last thing I want to talk about, I've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm sorry about that. I'll try to leave a couple of minutes for questions, but is the Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline. So I start with this mandatory reporting piece because I want to let you know that we are mandatory reporters of child abuse on the hotline as well. So we run the Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline. Actually, COVA used to run it, and we took over in 2013. We also have a text line and a way to search online for resources, but we are a tip and referral hotline. So if we get a call from a young person or with regard to someone under the age of 18, we are mandated to report that to either law enforcement or child welfare, depending on the situation. But for anyone 18 or over, we are not. And we believe in self-determination. So we allow them to make the decision of whether or not they want to report or whether or not they're just calling for resources or maybe just asking a question. Maybe they just want to see what's out there. About a third of our calls come from survivors. About a third of our calls come from service providers like yourselves, including law enforcement. Sometimes we'll get calls from folks who are working with someone who may have experienced trafficking, and they just need resources, or they just want to talk through the situation with an expert. Our hotline advocates go through about 50 hours of training and 12 continuing education hours per year. So they are human trafficking experts. They can help you kind of talk through a situation. You can leave it anonymous if you want to. We're not digging for information. We're just trying to answer your questions. We've got 326 referral agencies. So that of course includes the big ones like COVA, and Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network and Colorado Legal Services and TESSA down in Colorado Springs, and those who are receiving federal funding specifically to support human trafficking survivors. But it also includes several domestic violence organizations, sexual assault organizations, immigrant rights organizations, LGBTQ centers, all kinds of supports for individuals. It's everything from crisis services to long-term survivorship. So while we can attempt to fill, immediate housing and transportation needs, probably our most frequent request, aside from housing, are legal services. Questions about the legality of what's happened to them, how they can get their ID back, how they can get their kids back. We've got a ton of legal services questions. But we also have stuff like tattoo removal. We've got 2 tattoo artists that will remove tattoos for survivors for free. We've got a program at Metropolitan State University, a partnership that helps support survivors to graduate college if that's something that they're interested in. And we've graduated 70 survivors through that program. So we're talking about survival needs from, I've run away from my trafficker and I need help right now, to, I experienced this 10 years ago and I'm still experiencing mental health issues and I need support. go ahead and take out your phones and put those numbers in there, and I'll leave the screen up while you ask questions for 2 minutes. And I'm sorry for not leaving more time there. Kristen, if you have any questions, or Kirsten, let me know.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, we'll give folks a minute to type. Super informative. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. A lot of information to fit into a short amount of time. So if folks are interested, I will put my email address into the chat box as well so that you can reach out to me. I'm happy to send the slide deck if people were catching all of that as I was talking quickly.
Excellent. And yeah, as a reminder, folks should see 5 handouts available. And please go ahead and grab those at your convenience. Okay, there's your email. Excellent. Well, I think that was so thorough that you left folks not wondering about anything, which is awesome. And as a reminder,